I said kind of humorously last week when I was in high school and they asked me if Catholics are Christians, I said we're like Coca-Cola. It's the original soft drink. It's like, is Coca-Cola soft drink, then Catholics are Christians. So I want to say a little bit about the history tonight. So it's a 2,000-year history, but if you got a snapshot understanding of it, at least you have some idea of why there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian denominations and churches in the world today. So I think a core, remember the words of Jesus at the Last Supper in the Gospel of John. Father, I pray that all of my followers may be one, even as you and I are one. So the expressed will of Jesus for his followers is that we have a fundamental unity. And Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, is arguing very eloquently for unity in the Christian community. So if we think about it that way, I'm going to oversimplify Christian history a bit in doing this tonight, but it's hard not to do it when you're doing 2,000 years in 10 to 15 minutes. But the thing I would say about the history of Christianity is, in some ways, in the first 1,000 years, so the first half of Christian history, roughly, the great body of Christian believers throughout the world was what you might describe as fundamentally aware that they belong to one great body. So they use the term Catholic to describe this universal body of believers, the universal church throughout the known world at that time, which was mostly the Roman Empire, right around the Mediterranean area, with extensions in different directions. And they also spoke about that church as the Orthodox Church, and the word Orthodox literally means right praise, to give right praise to God, or right teaching. So the church that believed rightly and was universal was the great body of Christian believers throughout the world. And in the first 1,000 years, that was fundamentally one. Now that's not to say that there were not at times different small branches that broke off, what we would call today sects, S-E-C-T-S. So there were some controversies in the early church, and there would be break-offs, and then the church would have to deal with that. How do we deal with this group of believers that have separated themselves from the great body, or the universal body of believers? But I think, in a simplified way, you could say that fundamentally in the first 1,000 years, there was a fundamental great unity among the great majority of believers in Jesus Christ. So what happened? There are certain dates in the history of Christianity that I think are pivotal, and in the top 5, I would list 1054 in the top 5 dates. Now, why do I count 1054 in the top 5 dates? Because that was the very first serious rupture in the whole body of Christian believers, and that was between the Eastern and Western churches. And it's the first time in Christian history that you have a fundamental separation or break that is big and it is enduring. So it lasts almost to this very day, actually. So it's a pivotal point. This didn't happen overnight. So what happened? Well, one of the most famous emperors in the history of Christianity is the Emperor Constantine. So we're talking about early 300s. He saw a sign in the sky which converted him to Christ. And he established, for the first time in the Roman Empire, an edict of toleration. So you could be Christian in the Roman Empire from the time of Constantine without fear that you would be put to death, for example, or persecuted. It was not yet the official religion of the Roman Empire. That would happen later in the 4th century, but it was the edict of toleration of Constantine that set the church on path to being transformed from being a body of people in the empire who were fundamentally always under threat of being persecuted, to now you could be publicly Christian and it was safe. So what could they do? They could build churches, they could have institutions. So Christianity became more and more institutionalized. All sounds very good so far, but a second thing Constantine did that would have an enduring impact on the church, but would not become so clear for a greater period of time, was he decided to administratively divide the empire into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Empire. He established a new capital in Constantinople. So the Western Empire would be governed as the Roman Empire had traditionally in Rome, and the Eastern Emperor would be in Constantinople. So what you have for the first time in the Roman Empire is a political separation between the West and the East. That political separation corresponded with a linguistic fault line. So you had Latin speakers predominantly in the West, Greek speakers in the East. Remember, Christianity was born in the East, was born in what we call today Israel, or the Holy Land. So it was born in Jerusalem with the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's where the Christian community began. And from Jerusalem, the early Christian community spread throughout the Roman Empire like wildfire. And one of the blessings of the Roman Empire, by the way, was they had fantastic communication and transportation. The Roman road system was excellent. The administration and governance of the empire made movement throughout the empire very easy, which meant that early Christian missionaries like Paul could go rapidly throughout the Roman Empire telling the good news about Jesus, and there were converts throughout the Roman Empire. So the great theologians of the first 300 years were almost all Greek-speaking. The great administrators in the West were Latin speakers. I'm oversimplifying, but Latins were good at building things and administering things. Greeks were deep thinkers. So Christianity, the entire New Testament, by the way, is almost all written in Greek. So it's born in a Greek cultural milieu. In the beginning, the first followers of Jesus were Jewish. They would have spoken Hebrew or studied it as their official language, spoken Aramaic. So Semitic languages. But even in early Christian scholarship, by the time of the New Testament, it's almost all Greek-speaking. So very quickly, the Greek world becomes predominant. So when Constantine split the Roman Empire in two, with an emperor in Rome and an emperor in Constantinople, you had a whole world of thought in Greek, you had a whole world of thought in Latin, you had different political administrations. Now, how does the church fit into all that? Well, sort of like we're all Catholics today. We've got Catholics in the United States, and we've got Catholics in Mexico. That doesn't mean that we always feel like equal kindred with those who cross political or linguistic barriers, right? That's something about human culture at the backdrop of that. So there's always this tendency in human history to be a bit tribal, on us versus them, whoever they are outside of us. And that's true also even in the ancient world. So, and God's people, Israel, was very particular, separate from all the other nations of the world and so forth. God chose them especially to be his own people. So, but that said, remember that both Peter and Paul, the two principal apostles, both traveled to Rome. There were very active Christian communities in the city of Rome by that point. Both of them in the 60s are martyred for the faith in the city of Rome. So the shedding of their blood in the city of Rome established Rome in some ways as a preeminent place for Christianity. Remember too that Peter and Paul established churches in the East, and the great churches of the East were also considered fully what we would call today apostolic, founded by the original apostles. So we believe that Christianity goes back to Jesus himself, and in the resurrection and at Pentecost, the church is born. So there, from the side of Christ crucified and the risen Lord with the gift of the Holy Spirit, Christianity begins. And the apostles spread that faith throughout the Roman Empire. So the original patriarchal see, the place where Christianity was born, was Jerusalem. In the east, Antioch takes on a key place, first place that Paul tells us where they were called Christians. Alexandria in Egypt had a preeminent place, Constantinople would. So you have four major patriarchal sees in the east, where bishops, metropolitans have great authority. But there was only one in the west, and that is the city of Rome. And it always had this special role of leadership because of Peter and Paul calls martyrdom. And particularly, it became connected with the Pope being the successor of Peter the Apostle. So even in the Eastern churches, they regarded the Bishop of Rome as having a special preeminence. Now what will happen over time is that in the West, in Rome itself, the bishops of Rome will argue that their preeminence is one of governance, that they have authority over the Eastern churches. In the East, they will argue that it's more a matter of honor, but they still have the authority preserved in the East. So this disagreement about how much authority the Bishop of Rome has would become a principal tension point between the East and the West. So you're kind of getting a picture in your mind. You've got a political separation between East and West. You've got a linguistic separation, language-wise. And now you have a tension about leadership. You know, what role does the Bishop of Rome play? Does he have authority over the Eastern patriarchs, or is he one preeminent equal among equals? That would be argued by some in the East. That's interesting because the first 7 ecumenical councils of the church, none of them were convened by a Bishop of Rome. They were convened by emperors, or in one case an empress. And most of them were Greek-speaking. In fact, a prominent bishop, Saint Rcia, I'm saying that correctly, he didn't even know that there were controversies in the East about the great Christological heresies. So I didn't even know this is that they already knew. So there was a lot of times in the West a lack of knowledge about what was going on in the eastern part of the empire. So what happens is, if you know the creed that we recite on Sunday, that goes back to some of the ancient councils of the church. And at one point, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, adds a word to the creed. And the word is filioque, the Father. So, 2 words. So we say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and the Pope added the words, and the Son. This was a theological controversy between East and West. Why? Because the ancient creed, according to the Eastern churches, had been set by the councils, and no single bishop, even the Bishop of Rome, can come and just make a change to it. But the Bishop of Rome argues, no, the authority of Peter, I can add the words from the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In Latin, it's filioque. So I can add that word, and the Pope would argue, and it's true that the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son, but the Eastern Church they would argue it's not from the Father and the Son, it's the Father through the Son. So, you can't just change the creed at will. So this became a burning difference. The other thing that happened, by the way, was the date that Easter was celebrated. In the very beginnings, they had a way of figuring out when Easter was celebrated that had been kept from the beginning. And one of the popes said, no, we're going to do it differently. That's why the Orthodox and the Latin Rite don't always celebrate Easter on the same Sunday of the year. And the Eastern churches said, no, this is ancient tradition, we're not changing it. And the Pope said, well, I have the authority to do it, we're going to change it. The Eastern churches said, no, we're not changing. And for several decades, the bishops of Rome allowed that to happen. And then finally, one of the popes condemned the Eastern churches for not celebrating Easter at the quote-unquote proper time. So the East said, wait, we've got the ancient tradition, you're wrong, So the East has always been very much emphasized the element of the ancient tradition of the church. And we think Catholics are traditional, the Eastern churches are even more emphasizing tradition. So what happened was these tensions between authority in the church preeminently, the role of the Bishop of Rome, the political language separations, all that developed over time. And 1054 is the cataclysmic year. So what happened? Well, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, sent his representatives to Constantinople. And his representative was carrying from the Pope what was called a bull of excommunication, which means that the Bishop of Rome decided to excommunicate the entire Eastern Church. And so what did the representative from the Pope do? he walked into the cathedral church during the celebration of what we would call Mass, or the Divine Liturgy, they call it. And during the Eucharistic prayer, he laid on the altar that bull of excommunication. The Eastern churches, by the way, have never forgotten this. So when you read a Bible that was translated in English that had the history of the Orthodox Church, and that historical event was recounted in some great detail. So essentially the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, on behalf of the Western Church, excommunicated or put out of communion the entire Eastern Church. So this is the first major split in the history of Christianity. What did the Patriarch of Constantinople do? He excommunicated the entire Western Church. So mutual excommunications. There was an attempt, I think in the 1400s, at the Council of Florence to try to heal the split between the East and West. Unsuccessful. And in fact, those excommunications were not formally lifted until the 1960s. Pope Paul VI, after the Second Vatican Council, or during it, I'm not sure of the exact date, and the Patriarch of Constantinople lifted the excommunications. So in the work toward Christian unity, they've been trying to repair that. Pope John Paul II was very strong in saying that the Church has of both lungs, the eastern and western parts, and we need both lungs to breathe. So popes in the last 50 plus years have been working very hard to try to heal the split between the East and the West. The Eastern churches have been a bit more hesitant about that. So they don't want to lose their tradition or their autonomy. So Pope John Paul II, late in the 1900s, wrote a letter asking for those outside the Catholic Church to begin to reflect and write about what role the Bishop of Rome might play in a united Christianity beyond the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church. He's inviting people in other Christian churches and denominations to think about how the Bishop of Rome or the Pope could be an instrument of unity beyond the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church. So Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, they've also continued that work of trying to heal that split between the East and West. So today when you look at the Orthodox churches, like the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and so forth, they all have ancient apostolic roots. We believe they have fully valid bishops and sacraments. So they have a full economy of salvation, we would call it. They're fully apostolic. So the main thing that they don't share with us at this point, the key factor now, really is the authority of the Bishop of Rome, or the role of the Pope. That's probably the number one key obstacle that prevents there from being unity right now between East and West, probably above and beyond everything else. So, but that split between East and West has been enduring. Now, there are members of all those Eastern churches that join together and profess the unity with the Pope. And these are called the Eastern churches in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. So we have something like, well, we have the Latin Rite, to which most of us belong, the Roman Rite, but we have also connected to the Catholic Church now about 21 different Eastern churches. So we are so that's why we're not, it's best not to say we are Roman Catholic, because we're Roman Catholic, the Roman Rite is in the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is broader than the Roman Rite, so we're 21 rites or churches within the Catholic or Universal Church. That's why the Catechism of the Catholic Church is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, not of the Roman Catholic Church. So we're broader than Roman Catholic. So, so this great split is the first great split in the history of Christianity. That's why we are not all one. Now, another key date, and again, I would list this in the top 5 most important dates in the history of Christianity, is the year 1517. Anybody know what happened in 1517? Or a German Augustinian monk by the name of Martin Luther nailed 95 theses, that's the classic rendering of it, to the church door in Wittenberg, protesting, thus Protestant, protesting what he saw as some of the major abuses of the church at the time. So what was going on at that point in the history of the world? I'm again oversimplifying history here, but you have the development of a burgeoning pre-nationalism. So you have German princes who are increasingly irritated, for example, by money flowing out of the Germanic areas of the empire down to the city of Rome. Why was money flowing from Germanic areas to the city of Rome? Because the Pope was doing great building projects, including the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And the confluence of these great events was that the Pope needed money to do it, and in those days, one of the things that they did was sell indulgences. What's an indulgence? Well, the fundamental idea is that when one sins, one not only gets out of communion with God and has to be forgiven, but you've also wounded yourself in a certain way, and that wound has to be healed, so for you to enter into heaven. So that woundedness can be healed with an indulgence. An indulgence is a prayer, an action of love, something that you do, which, by the way, we teach today that perfect charity heals all that effective sin. It's in the catechism today, thankfully. But indulgences began to be misunderstood in the Middle Ages as a way to buy oneself into heaven on the part of some ordinary folks. And some people preached it that way. And one could also do it for people who had died. So Martin Luther was a scrupulous German Augustinian monk who never felt he could earn God's salvation. And he was studying Paul's letter to the Romans when he read the words that we are saved by faith. And for him, it was like a lightning bolt. We're saved by faith, and he used the word faith alone. So by faith alone we are saved. It's not, we can't earn our way to heaven. So sola fide, faith alone. And he would argue that this faith that we have that saves us is given by God through God's grace alone. Sola Rcia. And how do we know that? We know it from the scriptures, from the Word of God. And he would quote Paul's letter to the Romans preeminently. He didn't enjoy the letter of St. James quite as much because James doesn't quite say that like Paul does. But he would say it's scripture alone that tells us the truth. So all the traditions that had developed from the time of the early church until the medieval period, and Luther's mind had to be judged against the rule of scripture alone. So scripture alone gives you the truth. Martin Luther, by the way, had traveled to the city of Rome as a monk, and he looked around the city of Rome, and what did he see there? He saw prelates of the church living in unbelievable luxury. He saw moral abuses. There might be parallels in the 21st century that we don't want to go too deep into tonight. I will just add as an aside that anybody who chooses to become Catholic has to remember that the Catholic Church, like every other human institution, is composed of human beings. And where you find human beings, you're going to find sin. So on one level, we need to be properly prepared. You're not going to find a perfect community in the Catholic Church. We're full of flawed people, with our own wounds, our own sins, and our own weaknesses. So that doesn't mean we accept them. It means we work to heal the wounds and to promote goodness. But, we have to also remember that you're never going to find a perfectly healed human being. We only believe two human beings were without sin in history, Jesus himself, and we also believe his mother, Mary, was protected from both original sin and also never chose to sin. We'll say more about Mary later. But what happened was Martin Luther saw how awful the situation of the church was. He heard these preachers preaching about buying your way into heaven. That's the way he interpreted what some of them were saying, probably correctly, but not what the church really would have taught officially. So to make a distinction between the way things got simplified versus the official teaching of the church. That's when he had this, rebellion against, we're not going to accept that anymore. It's faith alone that saves you by God's grace alone, and you know that through Scripture alone. If Martin Luther had lived 100 years earlier, Rome would have demanded that he be turned over to them, and he would have probably been burned at the stake, as the Albigensians and Waldensians were. But what happened was, you now have these German princes who don't want to be sending all their tax monies to Rome any longer. And what do? They say, we're going to protect him. So what began to happen was what I'm called the burgeoning beginnings of a national sentiment. So the German princes are now beginning to exert some of their independence and autonomy. A second key thing you have to remember is, and this is also very important, was that the printing press had recently been developed. So no longer did you have laborious copies of manuscripts being made in monasteries. Now the ideas of Martin Luther could be printed off quickly and disseminated around Europe, so the thought process could be rapidly distributed in a way that never before could happen in human history. All these things are important. Now, it's also important to add that Martin Luther was not the first person who was unhappy with the immoral situation of the church. So you had a great humanist like Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was very critical of the way that Christianity was being expressed and interpreted, and also the way it was being preached. He was fully Catholic. He was very critical. He was an eminent New Testament scholar, great with Greek, and he was critiquing the church, but Luther took the step of defying church authority. The Roman authorities responded slowly. The Pope was out hunting, and they told him what was going on in Germany, and I think his first reply was, oh, that's a squabble among monks. We're not going to get involved in that. Little did he know what was going to happen, how things were going to unfold. So this will produce what we call the second major split in the history of Christianity. It's the beginning of what we call the Protestant Reformation. So Martin Luther stood by his guns and was excommunicated by the Pope in 1521, and thus began this permanent split between Protestants and Catholics that's still not healed to this day.
Two questions. Where did Martin Luther do this mailing of the theses? What city?
Wittenberg. Wittenberg or Burg? Anybody know? Wittenberg.
And what language was the Bible written aside from German?
So you have the beginnings of what we call translations of the Bible in the vernacular. So Martin Luther would have been eminent in Latin. He would have studied the scriptures in Latin, but certainly editions of the Word of God were coming out in German and English and so forth in that century. So you have new translations in more readable languages for the ordinary people in the streets. The Catholic response was slow. Popes were afraid by that point of ecumenical councils. I could go into more depth about that, but there had been anti-popes, so it was contested who was the real pope a couple centuries earlier, and councils had to be convened to try to resolve that problem, and asserted some authority over the bishops of Rome. So the bishops of Rome were afraid to convene councils. They waited a long time, but eventually they did convene an ecumenical council, Council of Trent. And that's an interesting story because Trent did both a reformation of Catholicism. It attempted to reform the abuses, the moral abuses, and other abuses in the church, but it also attempted to respond to Martin Luther and the other Protestant thinkers' ideas. And the reply of the Catholic world to Martin Luther's ideas is what I would call carefully nuanced. So when you study the Council of Trent, for example, it doesn't say that faith is not essential to our salvation, but so we'll use, this is where the great Catholic both and comes in. In reply to Luther, the Catholic Church will say it is both faith and the way we live that faith out. In other words, our actions, our works, our orientation of love put into the flesh that determine our salvation. It's not faith alone that saves us, but the reply in the Catholic part is it's our faith and works, the way we live that faith out. And that's why Luther didn't like the letter of James, because James says, you show me your faith without works, and I'll show you how I put my faith in works, or the faith that exists in our works. So even in the early church, they're already kind of thinking their way through those great questions. So the second reply to Martin Luther and the other Protestant thinkers is, it is not simply God's grace alone, although all human salvation is God's grace. It's a free gift from God. But it's grace and the human cooperation with God's grace. We have the ability to say yes to the gift of God's grace. That we couldn't do without God's grace, but they both belong together. Grace and human cooperation. God includes us in a partnership, a covenant that enables us to respond to God's free gift of grace. And the third thing the church will say clearly is we know God's revelation through Scripture and tradition, with a capital T. So the apostolic faith has been handed down in both Scripture and tradition. Together they form the Word of God. And the Catholic world always understood that. The Christian world always understood that. The Scriptures were born in the church itself, and the living church. They were written by early Christians, and the canon of sacred scripture that we call the New Testament was recognized gradually over the first 300 years of Christianity. So it's a both and. That's the response on the part of the church toward that great question. After Martin Luther, John Calvin was even more severe in his rejections of traditional Catholic thought. So the great Lutheran worldwide movement springs from Martin Luther himself. The Presbyterians flow out of the great Calvinist thought. And John Calvin, by the way, also emphasized very much the utter separation between the holiness of God and the depravity of human beings. So if you want to add faith alone, Scripture alone, grace alone, he would say God alone. Human beings are totally depraved. There's nothing good in us. One professor of theology I had said, the fundamental Protestant thought about human beings is we're fundamentally a pile of manure, I'm using a kind word, and God's grace simply covers over that manure. So it doesn't really change us from within, but God sees us as essentially righteous because of grace. Whereas the Catholic belief has always been there is a communion between God, even though God is wholly transcendent, which enables us to have a true communion with God, and that salvation actually transforms the human person. So we're not a pile of manure anymore. We're essentially transformed from within by God's grace and our human cooperation with that grace. So that's why, by the way, in Catholicism, we have an essential kind of trust in the human condition, even though we're wounded by sin. Whereas in many of the Protestant strains, the depravity or the sinfulness of human beings is sort of at the center of their thought. And so it's a different way of looking at human beings to some degree. So a fundamental believability we have is that God's grace can really change us and give us a new beginning. Whereas the Protestant emphasis has always been on we're just sinners who are given the gift of redemption sort of from the outside.
They also deny free will as well.
Calvin did deny free will, predestination, that God predestined some for hell and predestines others for heaven. Many modern Presbyterians are not aware that that double predestination is part of their tradition. But that is one element to John Calvin's thought, double predestination.
In a way, Luther believed that too.
Luther less so than John
I
Calvin.
believe that was his thought as well, when he's somewhat saying that we are nothing but the power of God, and God covered us over us as snow.
Right.
But so in a way, he also kind of believed that. But then they also believe as well, like the Catholics saying that with God, we are changing from glory and glory.
Right.
to
And the Eastern traditions, of course, even emphasize more. The human person is not only redeemed, but we're made God. We're divinized. We're made divine by God's grace. We share in God's life. So we become, one with God. So yeah, difference between East and West, and Protestantism is the polar end of that. Now, if you had just Luther and Calvin, you already have a big thing, but in 1608, John Smith, one of the early originators in that Calvinist tradition of the Baptist movement. So we live in a country in the southern United States, we're surrounded by Baptists. That comes from the 1600s. And you have this great movement called the Anabaptist movement, and their goal was, in a sense, to kind of bypass centuries of Christian history and to try to recreate the original church of the beginning. So they are very radical in their rejection of anything that developed after the New Testament period. In a similar strand of thought, the churches of Christ, which are also very prominent in the southern United States today, rose in holiness movements of the 1800s and 1900s. And again, the fundamental idea was an attempt to recreate the apostolic church as if those last 1800 years of Christian history had not existed. So an attempt to bypass the living Christian community that had been around for centuries to recreate a pure New Testament church, as it were. One can never do that, by the way, completely, can you? Because the New Testament doesn't give you all the directions. Although the Church of Christ, until they got a little more progressive, tried to do it. It would even say you don't use instruments at worship services because the New Testament doesn't speak about instruments in the New Testament. So you can't use them because they're not mentioned in the New Testament. So just an example of how in Christian history you start seeing it branching out. The Methodist movement, by the way, I'll say a word about that a bit more. The Church of England is a sort of an unusual exception. When Luther and Calvin and the other Protestants, Zwingli and others, began to reform Christianity, King Henry VIII was at first an ardent defender of Catholicism. In fact, he was given the title of Defender of the Faith. But when he wanted to divorce his wife and remarry, because he couldn't have children with her, and was denied an annulment by the Church of Rome, he decided, I'm simplifying history, he decided no longer was it a Catholic church, he was the head of the Church of England. So thus Anglicanism was born. Then in England over a couple of centuries, what happens is you get radical Protestant ideas blended in with very Catholic ideas, and so that's why Anglicanism, by the way, the Episcopalian Church in the United States and the Anglican Communion, has a very wide diversity of thought within it, because it agreed in the end to accept a full range of ideas from very Catholic to very Protestant under this big umbrella that it calls the Anglican Communion. And that's why even today, for example, when questions come up, for example, about gay marriage or gay ordination of bishops and that sort of thing, that the Communion is trying to create the possibility of diversity existing within this big tent. So Anglicanism was born, and Methodism, the Methodist Church, John Wesley and his brother Charles, they flow out of the Anglican tradition, but they felt it was a bit too stuffy, and that someone needed to go into the coal mines and preach the good news of Jesus Christ. They were trying to add a new vibrancy and faith to the Anglican Church, and thus a new Christian stream, Methodism, is born. from their efforts to do that. So, and some of the great Christian hymns that we in the Catholic Church sing to this day were written by the Wesley brothers. So, and the Methodists have been strong on emphasizing the Gospels and the Gospel of love in particular. So I tend to find in the South, by the way, that Methodists and some Episcopalians tend to be very warm and open to us Catholics, a little less open are the Baptists, a little less open the Churches of Christ. So you have this whole spectrum of responses, although a lot of that is changing. I'm good friends today with a couple of professors at, I can't remember the name. What's the Church of Christ University in town? Lipscomb, yeah. I'm good friends with a couple of theology professors at Lipscomb, and we have this great relationship. So, so there are many in the Churches of Christ in recent years that are much more ecumenically open to ideas and that sort of thing. So, since the early 20th century, by the way, there's been, it started in the Anglican tradition, there's been a movement called ecumenism, which is trying to bring Christians back together, and it was very much embraced by the Catholic Church at the Second Vatican Council. So we are on board with the idea that we have to bring Christians back together. So, and we used to, before Vatican II, there was a demand that you return to us, but we speak now of reintegration, trying to bring us back together in communion. So it's more nuanced than it once was.
What was the name of that movement?
The ecumenical movement, ecumenism.
Ecumenism?
E-C-U-M-E-N-I-S-M, ecumenism. And we Catholics, well, let's say this too. Early on in the Protestant Reformation, the attempt to keep Christian unity resulted in wars and violence. We decided after a while to stop killing each other about it. And then it was just condemnations. And we called Protestants heretics. We called the Eastern churches schismatics. Since the Second Vatican Council, we've tried to speak in more thoughtful language. We speak of our separated brothers and sisters. So people don't respond well when you call them heretics and schismatics. And that doesn't create the possibility of very genuine dialogue. So, or connection, or communion. I'll also add, by the way, that even though the Catholic Church was very good about saying both and, the funny thing that happens is that as Protestantism develops, and they emphasize Luther's great idea that Scripture alone is the source of truth, and downgrade tradition, what do Catholics do? We emphasize tradition more and kind of don't focus on Scripture as much really until the 20th century. So the things that are the most different than Protestantism, we tended to highlight. And one of the things that Protestants weren't much into are things like the role of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So Catholics really emphasized Mary. So anything that made us unique or different or separate from, and we might talk about those things far more than we would talk about the great things like the Gospels or Jesus that bind us together. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that was the tone in Christianity prior to the ecumenical movement and the Second Vatican Council. So that us versus them stuff definitely got in the way. So that's just a quick overview of the history of Christianity, so you understand how we got from essentially one great body of believers to this great multitude of different traditions, denominations, and churches. Yeah.
Brother Mark, you've given us two pivotal dates. Before you end, I'm curious about the other three of the 5 key dates.
Oh, if I had to give you 3 other pivotal dates, yeah, I would say 3, 11 or 13, the Edict of Toleration, when Constantine made Christianity legal. That would be one of my top 3. Those would be my, and of course, the death and resurrection of Jesus, roughly AD 33, would be number 1 on the list. So the birth of the church. And date number 5, I don't know that I've got a 5th, so these are my top 4 dates. Father, you got a date? Another key pivotal date in the history of Christianity?
I came in late. What are the first 2?
This was talking about 1054 when East and West split, 1517 when the Protestant Reformation began, and then the Edict of Toleration of Christianity, the birth of the church. That's 4. You have a fifth pivotal date in the history of Christianity.
What would it be? Sometime in the 19th century when we lost the papal states.
1929, 27 is the loss of the papal
Yes.
states, or was it before that?
It's 18 something. But that's
Yeah.
a huge shift from the church having political power
Yeah.
to solely spiritual.
Yeah, to the Bishop of Rome being restored to a purely spiritual authority rather than running a government. Yeah. And Vatican II, certainly, yeah, when you're this close in history to a date, it's hard to understand its full significance, but as we look back someday, it may be that in fact, that 1962 with the convocation of the Second Vatican Council has fundamentally altered the trajectory of Christianity. So we'll see. And 500 years since our ancestors came. Let's put something in a time capsule and see what we can discuss about that. Okay, so first evening, a little bit about how we're connected. Tonight, a little bit about the historical reasons that Catholicism is now unique in the Christian family. And the third Roman numeral I want to do before we wrap up tonight is some unique elements about being Catholic. I'll be saying a lot more about it this year, but one of the key things about that is very uniquely Catholic, especially in contrast to much of Protestantism, is what I call a sacramental vision of the world. So we Catholics see things with sacramental glasses, and the 7 principal sacraments for us are pivotal moments of worship of God, and through which God comes to us to redeem and save us. So we Catholics, it's hard to imagine living our Christian life without a broad sacramental vision that expresses itself in very embodied ways. Now, the Orthodox are also highly sacramental, so that's not totally uniquely Catholic, but it is certainly one of the defining characteristics of being Catholic that makes us stand out apart from a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters. The big thing that I mentioned about this both and approach, that we are both, we emphasize God and the world, and like Calvin, who separated God and world, faith and works, living out our faith, grace and human cooperation, scripture and tradition. So with our Protestant brothers and sisters, that awareness of this both and is a huge element for us Catholics. A third thing, very important, is our great sense of tradition. We root ourselves all the way back to the very beginnings of Christian history. We are, with the Orthodox, the original apostolic churches. And that is different than Protestantism, which branches off at some point in history. Our sense of universality. So we're part of this universal body of believers that encompasses very different cultures, nations, languages, humanity all over the globe can be Catholic. So when you become a member of the Catholic Church, you're not just part of St. Henry, you're part of this universal body of believers. Okay, quick moment for advertisement. This Sunday, we're going to celebrate the universality of our Catholic Church here at St. Henry, and we're going to be celebrating that this Saturday evening, a big international festival dinner. And on Sunday, at the 11 o'clock Mass, we're going to celebrate that diversity. I think we've got 35?
We've got 40 nations.
40 nations represented here at St. Henry. They're going to carry flags in at the 11 o'clock Mass. We're going to hear the word for peace in many of those languages. So we're going to celebrate our Catholicity this Sunday here at St. Henry. It's a beautiful way to focus on this theme tonight, our universality. And last but not least, that whole sense of apostolicity. We're connected to the apostles through apostolic succession, principally through, and we'll say more about that later as well, that we do believe that the Bishop of Rome, as the successor of Peter, has a unique, irreplaceable role in the church. He has been entrusted with shepherding authority over the whole universal church. So we have the universal earthly shepherd that mirrors his share in the shepherding of Christ, who is the eternal shepherd. So, by the way, we'll say a lot more about the role of that successor of Peter, but that is certainly uniquely Catholic, including even among the Orthodox. So that does define us as Catholic almost uniquely. It's not to say that the men who have been in the office in that 2,000-year history are flawless. Some have been accused of heresy. Some have committed grave moral offenses. So we have a spotted record about that. I was reminded of this because of what's going on in the church right now, when you see failures of leadership to protect the innocent in our world. And I had to remember that Peter himself, at a pivotal moment when Christ is being interrogated, denies that he knew Jesus 3 times. So if the first of the shepherds fails in such a dramatic way, we should remember that our faith is never in the human beings that occupy those offices. It is in the God who creates us, redeems us, and sanctifies us in and through the death and resurrection of his Son. So it's a good reminder that we shouldn't put people on pedestals on which they do not belong in their humanity. So that's a sobering reminder sometimes. You know, it's kind of like as a kid when you first figure out that your parents weren't perfect and they did things that you're embarrassed by or ashamed of. Well, they're human beings, and so once in a while that happens, even with those in the highest offices, unfortunately, of the church. But there's a great responsibility, by the way, that all of us have by our baptism to be holy, to be Christ-like, and to live as we're called to live. And the higher in the church you go in the office, the greater is your responsibility. And the more with which you are entrusted, the heavier will your judgment be. I'm always mindful of that as someone ordained to share in the priesthood of Christ. That I have a greater obligation has been laid upon me because I have been entrusted with a responsibility from Christ. So we should not forget that. All right, John.
Maybe you covered uniqueness, would that include the view of the Eucharist?
Our uniqueness, the view of the Eucharist, I include that broadly in the whole sacramental vision because it's at the heart of our sacramental life. We do believe the Orthodox have valid Eucharist, so it's not solely defining of us, but it's certainly at the heart of being Catholic because it's at the heart of our sacramental life. Yeah, that's just a quick thumbnail sketch of some things that make us unique. There's a lot of, you drill down into some of these, which that's the rest of the year we'll be doing. So, all right, questions, as always, are most welcome in writing if you don't want to do them by email or if you want to do it aloud. And I'm going to ask Janet to come up. We have a special guest tonight. And you know, one of the things I love about being Catholic is it's not just a set of ideas, but that those ideas have to be embodied and lived in a human life. And when you hear a human being describe living Catholic faith and life, that's where you start becoming really inspired. That's the great gift, for example, of the saints. So